Let's talk about the value of learning assertive communication. You know what? Never mind. Like just don't bother. So I joke around a bit, and I was being a little bit passive aggressive in the intro because I want to demonstrate some of the nuances of communication and the value of assertive communication, specifically in addiction recovery. So there are some misnomers and ideas when it comes to teaching and understanding communication. And in the recovery world, a lot of it seems to be focused on and or around learning how to communicate so that you can keep your drug dealer at bay or say no, just say no to drugs or whatever that may be. And it's partially that, but there's so much more to the value of communication than we give it credit for. And assertive communication, which is one of the most widely taught skills, is critical to that because it's broken down into this easy to consume way. And it has some tangible skills that can be applied and practiced to make it so that we can communicate in a better way. So this one specific tool doesn't include all of the listening skills and body language and all those other things. This is strictly the way that we process our behavior and some of our words. So we'll go that today, but I want to start with the caveat of knowing that there's more to learn about communication, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But in this, we're talking more about the assertive style of communication and what that means. So assertive communication is not really self-explanatory as much as some might think, because the assertive communication sometimes gets mistaken for aggressive communication. And assertive is really somebody just expressing their needs and their wants or being able to communicate with another person in a healthy way. And so sometimes defining assertive communication is best done by describing what it's not. So what is an assertive communication not? There's different categories that we put communication styles into. The first one being a passive. A passive person is usually more of a people pleaser. When they're asked questions, they smile and nod. They go, yep, okay, we can do that, or whatever it is. They usually don't spend a lot of time being argumentative or pushing back. They're usually quite agreeable, and this is this idea of being passive. It doesn't mean that everybody who's agreeable is passive, but an individual who spends more time doing that, regardless of what their needs are or their thoughts, then sometimes that's what it means, is that they have more passive tendencies. So passive is the one communication style. Then we have aggressive. Aggressive communication is quite often finger pointing, raised voice, aggressive in the tone and body language. Can come off as, it could be yelling, it could be a whole bunch of things that could incite fear or bodily harm. So being very aggressive in a person's tone or talk. So that's another aggressive. So we also can see that with my example of passive. Sometimes someone can be aggressive, but it doesn't mean that that's their communication style. Then we have how I opened the show or this episode with passive aggressiveness, which is it's when the emotion doesn't match the words. So when somebody is very angry at something and they go, yeah, no problem. But then their actions are then counterintuitive. They walk away huffing and puffing or kicking their feet. And it was like, you said something, but you acted differently. So this passive aggressive. So passive aggressiveness is a combination of the two. So it's me being passive and not really communicating what's being communicated, but then acting in an aggressive way on the back end. So these are the three categories that assertive communication is not. So then the fourth category is assertive communication. So when we're not doing these things, we're not being passive, not being passive aggressive, we're not being aggressive, then the default is to go into assertive communication. And assertive communication is just a very healthy way for me to express what needs to be done. Now, we've done another video that is on boundaries. and that video on boundaries, this is a key component to recognizing how to apply boundaries. So if I'm trying to apply boundaries and tell people where I sit with them or what my needs are, or help them communicate their needs from me, and we're trying to create a healthy understanding of what our relationship is going to look like, but I'm being passive, what are the odds that my boundaries are going to be set appropriately? Passive aggressive, either way, if I'm using any of these communication styles, the likelihood of me having healthy boundaries and communicating my needs, or me allowing the other person to communicate their needs, becomes really small. And then that becomes problematic. So part of understanding boundaries is what we've talked about before, and understanding why that's important to me and understanding those things. But it's also applying a positive communication style or a healthy communication style to be able to implement those boundaries. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about understanding how we apply those things and how we can practice assertive communication, and a little bit better understanding of what it is. So there's a couple of tips and tricks we'll give you. These are not exclusive. There's lots more. You can go on the internet. You can find more valuable tools and how to communicate in an assertive way. But we'll give you some of the tips and tricks here today to hopefully give you a little bit of a head start. And we want to start with using I statements. I've noticed in the past that I've heard individuals thinking that I statements were egocentric, or that if I use a lot of I statements that I'm, thinking about me too much. And I see where people try to not use I in communication because of that, because they don't want to be perceived as selfish or looking at things from my perspective. And I get that sometimes in group communications or in the workplace. But when it comes to being assertive, it's critical. You're not talking about what you want them to do. You're talking about what your needs are. So it's more important to say, I feel this way. I have this need. I need you to do. The opposite to that is directive. So it's you and they, and that's external. It's me pointing fingers at other people and who needs to do what. Whereas the assertive formula communication is much better when it comes from me looking at my needs and how I feel and what's going on inside of me, so I can communicate in that in a healthy way. And I hopefully that everyone understands that difference, because it's really big. Because if we're saying you have to do stuff and this is what you have to do, that's me kind of bossing people around. And from the assertive side, it's saying, I'm not bossing you around. I'm talking about my perspective and what's going on from my view and what my needs are. And then we can communicate in a much healthier way when it comes to being assertive. In a world where seems to be a lot more passivity in person and more aggression online. Anecdotally, I just see it where people worry about what other people think. And even in the corporate world, the cancel culture, concerns or worries about saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. I've noticed in the corporate world that the ability to communicate in an assertive way can sometimes be perceived as aggressive when it's not aggressive. It's actually just assertive. So it's important that we continue to be assertive to set the tone for what's happening in our environment, so that people can recognize and see the difference between aggressive and assertive. And that's done through us regulating our emotional state and being able to express how I feel. But even if I'm feeling the need to be aggressive, or I'm feeling angry or upset, that it's taking a pause and walking away for a second and making sure that my emotions, they're valid, they're there, but they're not being used as a tool of communication to push my assertive process. Because if I'm coming at it from an aggressive lens, then I'm going to undo that. So it's important that we recognize that difference, and that the assertive communication is separate from any type of aggression, because that's the tone we want to set for longevity and being able to create long-term relationships. And if I go and sometimes I'm aggressive and sometimes I'm assertive, those blurred lines can make it very difficult for us to create a pattern of communication, and the people around us won't recognize it as assertive the way that we would hope. avoiding finger pointing. Big part of communication errors that we have, or at least unhealthy, I don't know if we'll call them errors, but unhealthy communication tactics is blaming. So we're trying to have a conversation with somebody talking about a specific topic, and instead of putting it into my side of the street and taking care of what my part is or my role, is very easy to point the finger outwards and be like, well, but if you did this, and if that would have been that way, and if you didn't talk to me that way first, then I wouldn't have talked that way back to you. And instead of taking ownership on our side, the assertive formula is me taking ownership on mine. This is how I feel. This is what's going on. And when we get into these conversations, it's very easy for it to turn into an emotional game of tennis. You did and I did, and you did and I did, and it's back and forth, and blaming and bouncing it back and forth. And sometimes we don't feel comfortable with the conversation, and instead of me taking my side of the street, I don't like how that feels. I'm going to then blame or throw stuff onto your side to make it so that I don't have to worry about how I feel, because I'm too busy looking at the mistake you made or what's wrong with you or how you did it, so I don't need to worry about my side. So in the assertive communication, it's ideal for us to be able to stay in that lane. So when the person says, but you did this, you can come back and say, well, that's not what we're talking about. Right now, we're talking about this, and we want to stay on this. And when we're done talking about this, we can talk about other stuff later. But right now, we are talking about this. And then staying in that assertive frame, not being passive, not being aggressive, not being passive aggressive, staying in that assertive frame of this is the conversation we're having, and this is what I want to talk about. People start to get used to that idea. So it's critical to hone that skill while you're learning to be assertive and set boundaries, to be able to stay on that one topic. In that same frame of reference, it's important to note that in the back and forth that we can have, that we're also trying to learn to recognize the value of forgiveness. When we're trying to have sort of communications with our loved ones, or people that are valuable in our life, or people we see all the time, people that are in our lives that we know that we're going to have continued relationships with, it's very difficult for me to have an assertive communication style without me first looking at how to forgive, or not. Forgiveness isn't turning on a switch, so it's not like you just forgive in that way, but having enough forgiveness to be able to have an assertive communication at least, and to be able to compartmentalize some conversations to say, I'm going to forgive you long enough to be able to have this conversation and not bring my baggage or my resentment into me being able to have this assertive communication. If I have these underlying terms or conditions or ideas of what the relationship looks like, then it's more important for me to come in there even keeled and figuring out how to set flat ground. Sometimes even having a conversation first, or even writing something down for yourself to say, I'm going to go talk to so-and-so, and for now, I'm going to let this go. For now, I'm not going to bring up this thing if it's not relevant to the conversation, right? I'm going to talk about gas in my car. I'm not going to bring up the resentment about how, you did something wrong to me 10 years ago. I'm going to write that down. So it's in our conscious awareness, so that when we walk up to have that conversation, we do that. So, and then working on long-term forgiveness for your own well-being, that's just, a positive, healthy coping strategy all around. And we can talk about that another time, but forgiveness is certainly valuable in this. You think that this would just be a simple, something that wouldn't need to be explained, and that's the value of honesty. And they say that the average person lies 33 times a week, like, and noticeably, not just, hey, how are you? I'm fine, like, not that, but 33 times a week, the average person tells a lie, and it's a lot. And most of it is self-protective. So we tell these lies because, sometimes people don't deserve to know certain things. We don't want to practice that level of vulnerability around individuals. It serves a purpose. and we're not condoning it, but it's not something that just that we can just ignore in the process of assertive communication. So when we're doing this process, we want to make sure that we're being as honest as we can with ourselves and with the other person. So when I'm going out to a person and to talk about what my needs are, it's important to reflect on, are these honest and are these in line with who I am when I'm setting this assertive communication? Sometimes we're going and setting assertive communication because we just think that that's what should be done. But if we look at the integrity of it, you go, well, I don't really need to be assertive in the situation. I don't need them to do that. Um, Maybe it's not even for me. Maybe it's for somebody else. Maybe there's reasons for me to have these communications that are not um, truly integral. And um, our emotions are probably a big part of that. So when we're being assertive, we want to be able to communicate very often from an emotional state, how this thing or whatever is making me feel. And sometimes that's difficult to articulate. So a level of dishonesty steps in and we tell people that we feel a certain way that we don't, to try and get them to do something that we need done, because we'll tell them that we're hurt or we're sad about something when really we're not, because we just need them to do the thing, whatever it is that we need them to do. It's really important when we're setting the stage for building long-lasting relationships. The integrity of our assertive communication is the guideline to that. And so that's what passive aggressiveness is. Passive aggressiveness is me being unintegral with what I'm saying, thinking, and feeling, and then acting a different way. So I don't mind if you borrow my car and the person borrows my car, and then, I go and I complain to somebody else, Steve borrowed my car again. I hate it when he borrows my car. Well, now you're, being unintegral and you're not being assertive. You're not helping yourself or the other person or how you feel in that way. So integrity has a little bit more, and honesty has a little bit more to do with it than you might think. And maybe not in the ways of just, telling a little white lie about the size of the fish you caught. So assertive communication, there's some formulas and some ideas of how to incorporate assertive communication into your life. And sometimes that can be taken into a very calculated, cold formula, and the assertiveness can come across as brash or just cold, right? And there's a part where we want to make sure that as we're learning this, that we're also learning how to be respectful. And we don't want to be fake, and it's not customer service, and we want to make sure our emotions match, but we have an opportunity to practice respect and healthy communication, and where culturally appropriate, using your please and thank yous and using your pleasantries. And there's no reason why I can't set a boundary and have a positive body language, and have an open posture, and recognize that how I'm communicating it can be in a very respectful way. And the difference between showing respect and being cold in certain situations, or being unemotional or rigid in the process of being assertive, can come up as unempathetic, and it doesn't have the same impact to some people. And for those of you watching who have experience with substance use or a background of addiction, you'll know that part of the emotional coping strategy and survival mode that people with addiction tend to go into, it can make us a little more sensitive to some of those subtleties of communication. So when a person comes off as cold in their communication, the immediate thought to the other person is, did I do something wrong? Are they mad at me, or what's going on? And to clarify, I'm not saying that you're responsible for how the other person feels when you're being assertive. We need to be clear of that. I'm not trying to manage the other person, but I do know that with the very subtle idea of knowing that I'm going to still be kind and compassionate and recognize the needs of the individual I'm being assertive with, there's certainly ways that I can make that seem a little softer and more in line with the direction that we're trying to build our relationship. So to continue looking at some of the ways that communication helps in addiction recovery is emotional regulation, and we talk about this frequently, is we're trying to build emotional intelligence and being able to understand how I feel, when I feel, what's going on, how do I interpret it. And if I'm practicing assertive communication, there are some strategies in that would suggest that it's really important in assertive communication to lead with your emotion. The assertive communication formula is something along the lines of, I feel a certain way when you do a certain thing, because of the outcome, and then what it is that I need them to do. So the value of this is there's a nice formula that you can use to apply and write down and learn how to be more assertive. To some people that can seem robotic and it can seem disconnected, but the point is that if you're starting with an emotion, it has two really big key benefits to a person in recovery. One is I'm learning emotional intelligence. So if every time I practice saying how I feel when I go to somebody with a problem, I have to think about it. I got to think, how does this really make me feel? And is this something I need to talk about or not? Right? Sometimes I just go to a person and say, I'm angry. Well, what does that even mean? Right? But most of the time it's I'm hurt or I'm sad or I'm lonely or I'm grateful, because sometimes it's positive stuff. And we lead with that emotion. We learn emotional intelligence through the process of doing that. And the second benefit to that is my emotions are not negotiable. So the beauty is that when I say I feel, hurt or unvalued when you don't put gas in my car or whatever it may be, the person can't come back and say, no, you don't. So that goes back to the honesty. I want to make sure that we're being honest about how we express those emotions. And if we're honest with it, then when the person says, or not that they would, or very infrequently, say, no, you don't feel that way, that's not negotiable. But if I was to say, you're supposed to fill my tank with gas, that other person would be like, well, I didn't know I was supposed to fill it up, and the price of gas is too expensive, and you never told me to fill it up, and all of the reasons why. And then you can have an argument all day about the logistics of, the etiquette around filling a car with gas, or the ups and downs of the rights and wrongs of it. But how you feel about them doing that action is not negotiable, because it's yours. It's how you feel. So all the way back to the beginning of the video where we talked about using I statements, because I am feeling a certain way, that's not negotiable. So we don't have to sit here and have an argument about how I feel about it. And when we do that, it gives a little bit more of a straight line of communication, and then we don't have to get off topic. We don't need to run around and argue about all the semantics around it. We can just focus on what we're doing to make sure that we're in line with my boundaries and how I feel about them. Self-esteem is a huge topic in the recovery world, and my capacity to be assertive and communicate my needs and talk to people about what's going on in my life and how it impacts me, their actions, my actions, and communicating it is an investment in how I recognize who I am and how I feel about myself. People who are setting assertive communication and setting boundaries, they're sending a message to themselves that says, I'm worth it, I'm valuable, my needs are important, right? And as long as they're healthy boundaries, we're not stomping on somebody else and we're not overstepping them, that assertive formula of me expressing my needs and what's important to me and how to do that builds self-esteem. I feel good about myself. When I'm advocating for me and doing things for me, that is an act of love towards me, and what a great benefit to your recovery. Relationships are, well, for me, they're the cornerstone of my life, because when I look at my quality of life, it usually has a direct correlation to relationships. If I'm getting along with mom, if I'm getting along with my kids, if my partner's happy with me, if my coworkers are content, my life is usually pretty good. If all of them are upset with me or I'm not getting along, I'm usually not coping so well, and I've got other problems going on. It makes it very difficult to manage life. So managing my coping and managing my quality of life is directly correlated to my ability to manage relationships. Assertive communication and boundaries are a beeline tool to be able to manage those things so that you'll feel better and more content and happy in your life. So assertive communication and relationships are super important. Stress reduction becomes part of daily routine as you practice this, because what we just talked about, relationships, if I'm managing those relationships, if I'm looking at my emotions, if I'm looking at how to set boundaries, the natural default of me taking all of these actions is reduce stress, because I'm being proactive in taking all of these things into consideration in my life. And I'm also being careful to not take on too much. Sometimes when we're overly passive, we say yes to everything and we end up with a bunch of stuff on our plate all the time. Or our aggression causes more problems that then I have to fix on the backside, because now I've got to deal with something that I did to make up for being aggressive. So when I'm being assertive, it creates more of um, a less stress, because I don't have these other impacts of my passive or my aggressive communication. And lastly, it is super important for decision making. We see people in addiction recovery that struggle with making choices, and all of those things that we just talked about are relevant to me trusting myself and relevant to me being able to make future choices, because most of the time, my current choice making, I used my past experiences to decide how I'm going to make current choices. When I'm not using assertive communication and I'm not setting boundaries, I'm not communicating in a healthy way, then my decision making is going to be scattered and all over the place. And then when it comes time to make decisions now, I'm probably not going to do the best at it, because of my past experiences with those decision making, or my ability to trust myself to make them. As we're practicing assertive communication and it becomes more common and used in our life in a more effective way, our decision making gets better. We feel more confident in those choices. We recognize the emotions behind them. We recognize how it helps me with stress reduction. We recognize the value it has to my future and my self-esteem, and all of those things come into play. And when we see that, our decision making gets better. So we're hoping that you'll take from this video the best that you can about assertive communication. We ask that you figure out ways to practice it, to implement it in your life, to do more research. You can practice assertive communication via text or sending messages to people, and doing it in a way that you don't have to do it face to face. But there's a bunch of different ways to practice this process, but it's something that even in the smallest way, start incorporating it into your life. Start recognizing that it's fluid. Sometimes we're assertive, sometimes we're aggressive, sometimes we're passive aggressive. We get that. But it's making it so that we're more frequently assertive than we are any of those things. Because there are times when I'm going to be passive and I'm going to take a step back. And there are times, inappropriate times, when I'm going to be aggressive because I'm trying to protect somebody. But on average, I want to be in that place of assertive communication. And that's going to help me have a healthy longevity in my recovery.